So so there was a translation that Google Translate did from Hungarian to English, and Hungarian has gender neutral pronouns, and the English was rendered as, and some pretty sexist, the English rendering was pretty sexist, like, he works, she sews, he professors, she nurses, or something like this. And so that was the original tweet. And what I thought was interesting was somebody did a second test of it, from Hungarian to English, where it was like, John, and they gave him a male name, and then they had some sentences to set up the context, and they had a bunch of pronouns, obviously referring back to John, but then the software just kind of like continued to do its thing with the pronouns, swapping the pronouns in a way that was not super PC.
Mhm.
So that was the impetus for this. But before we get into the tweets, I wanted to kind of set a bigger context, because I know that we're in a moment where people are talking about the politics of translation with this Amanda Gorman thing, and who can translate, and kind of like, what that is. And so I wanted to, I mean, if you want to talk about the Gorman thing, if you don't, I'm trying to get a sense of your feel for like the responsibilities of a translator, and in the context of maybe what you thought about that issue, and what in general, what you think about machine translation.
Okay, well, that's a lot of topics and a broad challenge to me, but let me try to take those questions up one by one. Um, the responsibility of the translator, in my view, is to represent faithfully what the author's intention is. And to do that, I don't think that a translator needs to share an identity with the person being translated, however one wants to define identity. Uh, in my career, I've translated more than 125 books uh, from a range of disciplines, many of them in history or the social sciences or economics. You read the Piketty book, which was probably the most widely read of all the books that I've translated. Now, what qualifies me to translate in so many different disciplines? I'm not sure that anything does except intense study. Before I sit down to translate a book, I read widely in the field from which it's being translated. Uh, many years of experience have equipped me to translate in a variety of disciplines. But of course, when you begin as a translator, you don't have that experience. So you have to have some kind of affinity, some knowledge of the culture from which you're translating. Now, that knowledge of the culture is acquired in various ways, perhaps by simply studying the language from books, perhaps by living in the country, having conversations with people there, by conversing with people who work in the disciplines, by reading widely in the disciplines from which you translate. Uh, for a poem like Amanda Gorman's, the challenge is different, but simply being of the same race as Amanda Gorman, I don't think is necessarily the qualification that one needs. Uh, a Black person growing up in France would not have the same experiences as a Black person growing up in the United States. Uh, Black people in the United States come from a variety of different communities, not all of which share experiences. So, what are the relevant experiences for a translator? It's very hard to say in advance. Seemed to me that the decisions being made in the Amanda Gorman case were being made quite arbitrarily without much discussion of what the basis of those decisions was. So I think in each case, it has to be made case by case. Usually, the author has a say in the selection of the translator, but many authors don't really have the tools to evaluate the qualifications of a translator. Uh, to be frank, publishers don't necessarily have the tools either. But the advantage an editor has over an author is that editors have worked with a number of translators in the past, have seen a range of the work of a particular translator, and therefore perhaps better placed than the author, him or herself, to make the choice. But the choice is not easy, and I don't think can be based on a simple definition of identity. What goes into a translation is so much more complex than what we usually mean by identity when we're talking about political identities.
So this is really useful for me because one of the two things. First, one of the topics that I have on my list. I don't have that many topics. I have like three, but one of them is just the possibility of, can a machine be a translator? Because this is sort of where Felix Salmon and I really disagreed on this business of Google Translate. My take was, this is a translation aid, like a turbocharged dictionary. It's a tool. It's not an actual translator. A translator is a person. And my reasoning there was various, but part of it was like, okay, well, a machine can't bear any moral responsibility for the translation, right? You're not going to say the machine is sexist. You can say maybe the programmers are, but this, it strikes me as a tool. But I think the other piece of it, which you've highlighted, is like, um, if we're going to do a thing where the translator has to share a set of identity characteristics with the translatee, then a machine will never qualify in any respect, right? So there's that piece of it.
Yeah. Well, I think I agree with you entirely that a translator is a person, a machine is a tool which can be used by a person. Now, I speak a number of languages. The main language, the only language in which I translate professionally is French, but I also speak German and Italian, and I used to speak Vietnamese thanks to the US Army. I've completely forgotten that. But when I read German, unlike French, where I'm completely fluent, in German, my reading fluency is good. My spoken fluency is limited. Occasionally, when I'm reading, I come across a sentence that is particularly difficult, and I will turn to a machine translation aid to help me take a first crack at it. Uh, so, in addition to Google Translate, I find that DeepL is quite good, and I mean, I would never use this professionally, but as an aid in learning the language, I think machine translations have come a long way. They're far better than they were when I first started looking at them more than a decade ago. So it is a tool. Now, with respect to the Hungarian text that you referred to that was criticized on Twitter for its sexism, I thought that the original text that was submitted was actually a trap laid for the machine because it gave a series of sentences that one might expect to evoke to elicit a sexist response from a machine tool, and it did as expected. It said. She is beautiful, he is clever, and so on. And had a series of sentences where, if you didn't know the sex and you were simply translating based on cumulative historical experience in the language, which is what machine learning translation tools are based on, you would obviously come out with that sexist reading. Now, I didn't know about the second example that you brought up, where they used gendered pronouns, John and Mary, say, and the machine continued to be sexist despite having that reference. Now, that's the kind of mistake that a human would not make, but a machine would. Uh, Another example that I once wrote an article on machine translation, and an example I used was from French. Uh, there's a common idiom in French, la petite phrase. If you translated it literally, would mean the little phrase or the short sentence or something like that. But it comes up in various different contexts in French. If you refer to la petite phrase of a politician, you would mean a kind of zinger or one-liner that was inserted into an interview or conversation. But it so happens that this is also used by Proust in his famous novel to refer to a short phrase of music, La Petite Phrase de Vinteuil. Vinteuil is an imaginary composer that Proust made up. And the Google Translate, it seems, was trained on among the training text used was In Search of Lost
You're hang on.
Time, Proust's not right. It translated Proust correctly, but it translated a newspaper article incorrectly because it didn't have that idiom. So, sometimes it can be hidden with a tool, a machine translation, but on the whole, they do remarkably.
Yeah, it's my connection is a little choppy. Are you seeing me okay? Testing, testing.
I'm seeing you okay, and so far so good on my end.
Okay. It hung up a little bit there, but it was the point, everything came through. Um yeah, it's interesting because one of
Okay.
the things that one of the philosophical things that here is that all these machine translation tools, and this is a thing that I sort of worry and fuss over in the newsletter. All these machine translation tools are trained on like this corpus, and so they embody the biases and prejudices and patterns that are in the corpus, right? And um
Right.
there's no way for the machine in the moment, at least not yet, although there is work being done on this, to steer the translation with reference to like a style or a fact pattern, or so you can have this tool that embodies this existing like knowledge about a corpus of text, but when it comes to like doing the actual translation, you can't kind of steer it except in this very brute force kind of way. Like I think Google uses a set of rules to like randomize pronouns in some cases. So there are things that they can do that are like sort of complex and brittle and rule based to um, it's almost like spraying vinegar on spoiled meat. You're kind of giving it trying to give it a better odor or mask the fact that there's something in the corpus that is not working. But to go back to your opener, you talked about how you read widely in the field. And so, as a translator, you're coming to it with this body of knowledge of this corpus. But then, when it comes to a specific work, you're going and deliberately trying to pull in current context. I take it from whatever area, sociology or economics or whatever. You're trying to pull in current context, and that's the piece that the machine that responsibility. I guess I would say, if I frame it in terms of responsibility, it seems like you take your part of your responsibility as a translator is to represent the language in this area of specialization as is currently being used. um, is that like a fair way to phrase it?
Yes, that's right. But essentially, that's what machine learning is also doing. The machine is trained on a corpus, and it's trained on corpuses in two languages, the source language and the target language at the same time. That's the same thing that a professional translator has to do. When I translate history, I read history in French, and then I also read history in English in a similar subfield of history to because you're translating for a community. The receiving community has its own conventions, and the conventions used by historians working in English, writing in English, are different from the conventions used by historians writing in French. So there are certain set phrases, I would say, that are used to uh, connote a certain relationship to a body of material or a certain authoritative posture of the scholar writing. And those phrases, if you translated them literally from French, would seem totally out of place in English. What you have to find is an equivalent for the French phrase that establishes the same relation of author to text as the French phrase does. And that's what what the human does in that case to establish that equivalence is exactly what the machine does to read corpuses from taken from the same context. Now the problem is that the engineers who set up the machine learning don't have as clear a definition of these sub communities that they're translating from. Machine learning might take a French corpus like all of French Wikipedia and use English Wikipedia as the target text. So that is a convenient way locating equivalent bodies of text, but it doesn't narrow down the communities as a human translator would. A human translator would take a much narrower community, say French historians writing about the French Revolution, and look at texts by English-speaking historians writing about the French Revolution to establish those equivalences. So I think that might be one direction that machine learning engineers might want to go, to think in terms of communities rather than more universal corpuses of text. Corpora, I guess, is the proper plural.
Yeah, that's a good point because in the sense of if you've got this one, like Google Translate is a sort of one size fits all, and this to me gets at why it feels like a dictionary and not a translator, because there's no implied community. The dictionary is supposed to be the same dictionary for all the people, and whether or not that's a real goal, or just an ideal. But yeah, I think this idea that a translation is from one community to another community. And I like your point about these kind of idioms that are, I guess in internet speak, we would just call them signaling. They're kind of tribal markers, it sounds like. You use a phrase in a certain way to signal a certain kind of status to the reader. And then
Exactly.
you've got to map that into the same signal from a different community.
Right. Exactly.
So yeah, that actually that insight though, I mean, so I agree with you about the Gorman situation, but then if I think about it in those terms, I'm thinking like, okay, if we're going to frame this into, and I'm just spitballing here, if we're going to frame this as community to community translation, then I think then what if there's a community on the other end of the Dutch translation that sees the Gorman poem as theirs and they're less concerned with like fidelity or with other kinds of like classic translator things. And for them, the identity characteristics of the translator is part of the translation. And that's like what makes it, because somebody from their community did it, or from a specific community did it. I don't know. I'm being super charitable. I think a lot of this stuff is about like food fights and signaling and, this kind of stuff. But I'm trying to think charitably with this insight that you just mentioned. And there's sort of like meta linguistic properties, like, the color of the translator that maybe go into this community signaling.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very good point. There's a translation theorist named Lawrence Venturi who distinguishes between domesticating and foreignizing translations.
Mm.
Uh, his point is that translations are often judged by how natural, in quotes, they sound in the target language. So a translation will be judged to be correct and beautiful if it sounds natural to an English speaker. And Venturi's point is that literary writing is often sounds strange in its native language. One definition of style used by Roland Barthes, the literary critic, was that style is a deformation of language from its neutral state into something that is distinctive to the individual writer. So if that distinctive style sounds quasi-foreign in its native language, then it should sound quasi-foreign in the target language, according to Venturi. And since editors in particular often don't speak the language from which the book they've acquired is being translated, they're not capable of judging whether a foreignizing translation, to use Venturi's term, is actually correct. It will sound strange to them, sometimes stilted, and therefore they may reject it, even though it's, in Venturi's terms, a good translation. So that's something with which translators grapple. I happen to differ with Venturi on that point. I think he exaggerates the degree to which a translation that sounds foreign is actually faithfully reproducing uh, the the quasi foreignness of the original source language. Uh, I think this is a particular sin in scholarly translation. When in the heyday of French theory, when a lot of highfalutin French literary theorists were being translated into English, um, translators who weren't necessarily well versed in the ordinary everyday use of French, but had come to the texts only through scholarly study, tended to translate relatively ordinary idioms into things that sounded foreign. And those foreign idioms became standard in the community into which they were being translated. They became tribal markers, to use your term, of those literary theoretical communities. And membership in that community required using some of these outlandish phrases, which actually were standard idiomatic phrases in French, but were mistranslated into English to sound exotic. And that's a case where I think maintaining the tribal markers or misreading the tribal markers led to bad translations, which then became tribal markers of their own and have therefore perpetuated themselves.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. 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 No, there's a lot there. I had a follow up on that, and I just completely spaced on it as I was listening.
Yeah, sorry, I was a little bit long-winded there.
No, no, it was like it was super fascinating. There's examples of this. So I did a ton translation of Greek prose and some Hebrew, back during my grad school and PhD work. And so I did early church history, Christian origins, and Second Temple Judaism. And so there are examples of this in biblical translation that escape me. There's Hebrew to Septuagint Greek translations where the Hebrew says one thing and the Greek says another, and then it becomes like the mistranslation becomes a point of theology. Probably the best example that I can think of is in Hebrew, and I think Isaiah, it's an unwed mother is going to be with child, and then the Greek translates it as Parthenos, which is virgin, our unwed mother, and then you get this kind of theology of virginity of Mary, and then becomes perpetual virginity. So yeah, so this is like definitely a thing. These sorts of like tonal things or mistranslation things where the target community seizes on this exotic like thing that's been exoticized in the translation, and then kind of builds a superstructure around it, or occupies it in a certain way, and it becomes part of their identity.
Right, and then when dealing with a sacred text, as you were, it becomes part of the identity of the religious community. So tampering with it is not permissible. I once got into trouble for this because I was translating a book in which a part of the Nicene Creed was quoted in French, and I translated without realizing what it had been taken from. And the editor was quite upset that I hadn't recognized this as a quote from Nicene Creed. So
Yeah, so this again, this is this exact scenario comes up in the New Testament where some New Testament writer in Greek is quoting from the Septuagint, and then it's not until later with modern scholarship maybe you realize this is like a Septuagint quote, and there's like a Hebrew like subtext underneath it that like wasn't recognized, or you didn't recognize when you're translating it. Especially like a new translator will translate something and not realize that Paul is actually, this is a riff and on a source text, and not anyway. This go ahead. So this is a good segue into like a second thing that I brought up that I'm still kind of noodling with. This came up in the thread, and I raised this point a little bit facetiously, but I'm still thinking about it. And let me look at my notes here. Um, so one of the points that I raised in this thread, in this Twitter thread on this Hungarian to English translation, looks like my connection's unstable. One of the points I raised in this in this in this Hungarian to English translation was, Hungarian, it may be gender neutral, but Hungary is not the most progressive country, right now. And so there's this like thought about like what's the relationship between the gender neutrality of the language and then the culture. I mean, Hungary, I think, is sort of in the grip of like a kind of right-wing dictatorship right now, is it not? I mean, I'm not the expert on European politics that you are, for sure. So I was thinking about this. I was noodling about this, and there are other, there are these other gender neutral languages. And so, to me, the way that tweet and that setup was presented was like, here is this pristine like piece of Hungarian that is not sexist, and then it's been turned into a sexism by in English by Google Translate. But I kind of wanted to problematize the Hungarian text, because I'm just looking at this and thinking, Hungary, now I know something about them. I have seen something about them in the news. And this is, Tagalog is also, I think, famously has a lot of gender neutral qualities, and whatever you think about them, pre-Spanish conquest, they were certainly Catholicized, I believe, along with the rest of the colonized peoples. And I don't know that that the gender neutrality of their language was a shield to them from from the Catholic Church. So I kind of want to get into a little bit of like Whorf hypothesis territory with you, and just kind of ask, in general, what's your take on this relationship that seems that people put so much importance on right now between the gender neutrality of certain terms or constructs, and like this or and larger social inequities?
Well, that's a difficult question for me to answer. I don't really have a view on that. Uh, I haven't thought about gender and race issues in terms of linguistic concepts. Something I have thought about is uh, economic attitudes embodied in language. For example, in German, the word for debt is Schuld, which also means guilt. And Germans are notorious in European politics these days for their insistence on budgetary balance and austerity. The idea that debt spending, debt financing, Keynesian economics, these are not simply economic errors, but sins, and sins for which one should feel guilty. So the idea that in German, the word for debt and the word for guilt are the same, that uh, seems to me to raise a problem. And, I wonder about whether that has some deep significance in Germany's attitude to austerity. Now, it's also true that if you think of it, the history of ideas, that there's a German school of economics, ordoliberalism, which takes this attitude. Now, what is the causal relationship? Was it the influence of ordoliberal economics in Germany that made Germany hostile to debt, or was it the embodiment of the equivalence of guilt and debt in German that made ordoliberals hostile to debt? I don't know which of those should be emphasized as more significant, but it is an interesting observation, I think, about the possible influence of language on political attitudes.
Yeah, it's super fascinating. I think now that I hear you say this, and now that I kind of like air it out verbally, what occurs to me is that the workaround for this, like, that's not a problem that one has to solve. Like, the workaround for it is the translation reflects the values of the target community and the source community in a certain way. And if the target community thinks that the words matter this way, then they should have that translation that's structured in that way that, like, makes them feel safe or makes them feel affirmed, or, has the biases that they prefer. And so I think the root problem is just the idea of a one size fits all translation tool, where that's communityless, that there's no source community and there's no target community. Because, like, I guess my point is, like, you can kind of solve around without sorting out this question of gendered pronouns and liberalism, or gendered pronouns and egalitarianism. You can kind of work around it by saying, like, okay, if you think that the gendered pronouns in the mix is important in terms of social justice, then you should have the ability to generate a translation that reflects those values.
Yeah.
Uh,
There's a controversy going on now in France about the use of what they call inclusive language. Since uh, French is a language in which all nouns are gendered, uh, there are certain status markers like professor, which is, or traditionally was, a masculine noun. So what happens now that there exist female professors in France? Uh, when the first female professors came on the scene, they resisted having their title gendered by adding an E to it. So instead of writing professeur ending in R, you would write professeur ending in E to denote a female professor. But some female professors felt that this was diminishing the status that they had achieved. They wanted to have the same title as the male professor, even if it was a masculine noun. Now, more recently, there's been introduced this what's referred to as inclusive writing, in which the word professor is spelled in the normal way, Professeur, and then you add a period and an E, so that the E becomes optional. And you apply this to both male professors and female professors. And to some, this is an aesthetic affront. People don't like seeing this. It's not the way French was traditionally written, and they would rather see either a male professor or a female genderized professor with the E without the period. That would seem more normal in writing, and they resent this attempt to write inclusively. And indeed, these texts written in inclusive language tend to be peppered with periods all over them, and they look quite ugly to those of us who are of a certain age and were brought up on French that didn't have this kind of excess punctuation in it. Perhaps it will become standardized and it will come to look totally normal in a generation or so if it continues. But at the moment, it's controversy in the language about whether this will make the language more inclusive or tend to split the French-speaking community into two tribes, one of which is inclusive and the other of which is exclusive.
let me just, I'm going to pause right here. I've got to take a quick break. 1 second, and I'm back. Yeah, it strikes me that this is sort of exactly the American Latinx controversy transposed into French.
Exactly.
So I've been talking to a friend of mine who is in machine learning and machine translation, and he's African. And one of our first conversations about some of these issues, he's in the UK right now doing a PhD, and he just was like, yeah, we're starting to have these America-centric problems that kind of emanate from, American culture. A lot of the culture war stuff, it seems that we're exporting, and in the arts and entertainment and language and this kind of stuff. And so this has kind of been a theme for him. And I guess this is certainly true in Europe. So would you say that inclusive language thing is like, is that, or am I being a conceited American? Is that like sort of an American export, or is this
Uh, Well, it's funny you should mention that because it's a live issue right now in France. Some political parties are claiming that uh, gender and cultural studies exported from the United States are corrupting French academic culture, and they want to put a stop to it. Now, the irony is that those disciplines that they see as being imported into France are actually disciplines that were originally influenced by French theory, exported from France to the United States. So it's coming now full circle. But yes, it is seen as an American import right now in France and other European countries.
I think the solution for that is for me to just raise an objection as an American that you cannot appropriate our culture war. That's appropriation. Don't appropriate the culture war. Like stop doing all that stuff.
Yeah, well, the whole notion of cultural appropriation offends me as a translator because my whole life has been devoted to cultural appropriation. I have spent decades upon decades trying to make myself more French, to learn everything that I can about French culture and to immerse myself as deeply as possible. And now it's alleged that that's some sort of cultural crime, that one is trying to be something that one isn't. And I can't think of any culture that is so pure, so free of foreign influences that it can uh, take offense that other people should be attracted to it and try to learn it and immerse themselves in it.
Yeah, I'm in the same school of thought as you on that topic. I do. It's funny. I kind of go around and around with this because I understand the case of Elvis, and the fact that Elvis stole this music and made a bunch of money off of it. And so I have a hard time like not crediting the Elvis problem. And so I'm always trying to reconcile like my feelings that Elvis was something of a thief with my feeling that that cultural appropriation is not a real thing that exists and it's like it's sort of an invented crime. Like I don't know, I kind of hold the two in tension a little bit. Uh,
Well, yes, Elvis was a thief and made a lot of money off his thievery, but in my uh, earlier days, I was deeply into Mississippi Delta blues, and it was a music that spoke to me. It was not my own culture by any means, but I learned to play the Delta blues. I thought quite well, and it shaped my development, my attitude toward American culture, and my interest in the civil rights movement, all of that. So, was that cultural appropriation, or was it a broadening of my cultural horizons that made me a comprehending and whole human being? I think the latter and not the former, and I would resent anyone who accused me of cultural appropriation because of my interest in Delta blues or in American jazz, which became a later influence on my musical taste.
Yeah, likewise. I had a kind of similar trajectory in undergrad. I was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana at LSU, and there was a blues dive bar run by Rockin' Tabby Thomas, the Swamp Blues King. And me and my friends would go there and do open mic nights. And it was pretty mixed, I didn't become, I had like a standard kind of white boy blues collection. I had like some Howlin' Wolf and some BB King and random things of that nature, Buddy Guy. But I didn't have like a real deep catalog. But then I got into jazz later, and then similar thing. Like you see this in gospel music. So my background is Southern. My musical background really it would be Southern gospel, and because I grew up in church hearing the music and playing it, and there was like black gospel and southern gospel, and we made this distinction. Southern gospel is basically bluegrass, and then black gospel is like the choirs and that kind of stuff. And there was a lot of kind of crossover back and forth, especially in my denomination, where the white church would appropriate something from the black church and then would like give it a twist, and then the black church would take it back and like do their own twist on it. And there was a little bit of that interchange over the 90s, and it seemed like exchange. I mean, it was also struggle. I don't want to say it's free exchange, because these are two communities that are in tension with each other, and where there is some strife and some problems, and so there's like a back and forth of a struggle with this music. But my feeling was to be part of that struggle and to be a white person who played in black churches. I played bass. Actually, you can see one in the background there, who played in black churches. I liked being in the middle of that cross current, as turbulent, as it was.
Right,
So,
right. Yeah, I
um,
think we're on the same wavelength there. So,
so yeah, so thanks a lot. I don't really have much more. I mostly just kind of wanted to rap about this stuff, and this has been really helpful for me. And there's like a lot of good insights in here. I'm going to take these and take this stuff and put it on the blog, and I'll send you like a private YouTube link, and you can take a look at it. And I may or may not like want to put this up. We'll see. I may actually just put out a newsletter. I'm going to stop recording. Um, Oh, okay. So before I start recording, thanks a lot. Thank you for coming on, and I will follow up about this.
okay, it's my pleasure, and it's particularly nice to meet you finally face to face, as it were, even if it's electronically only.
Likewise, likewise.